As expected, right after winning his match, headlines about Jae Ki-young still having what it takes to be a champion, despite his injury, were published. Also, because of his most recent victory, Jae Ki-young's match fee doubled. Even the other athletes at the gym shared in his glory. The media and the public were in a frenzy. And once again, another chapter is finished. On Dan's first visit to the hospital, after returning from his trip abroad, he brought the souvenirs he bought for Grandma and her nurse. For Grandma, it was a very pretty pink shawl that she knew had cost a lot. Not that Dan minded. It was for Grandma, after all. As the nurse puts the shawl around Grandma's neck, she asks Dan about his trip to America. Dan tells her it was amazing, and that he'll take her with him next time. Grandma then brags about how she saw the match. When Dan asks how that happened, since Grandma isn't supposed to be leaving her room, Grandma explains that there's no way she'll miss the chance of seeing her grandson on the big screen, so she insists until she's allowed in the common room where the television is. And although Dan tells her that there's no way he would appear on TV, I know for a fact that Grandma was talking about Jae Ki-young when she said grandson. Am I right? Or am I right? Heh. Anyways, the topic quickly moved on to Jae Ki-young, to whom Grandma is eternally grateful for bringing Dan to America and doing many things she was supposed to do for him. Grandma then reminds Dan how important it is to give back as much as he received. Therefore, Dan should treat him well. If only Grandma knew how well Dan treats the beatard, she'd cry. Moving on, Dan reminded them about the blood work that would be done on Grandma today, and told them he'd wait for them outside while it was underway. Grandma tries to send him back instead, since he's supposed to be busy, but he insists he's not. And so, Dan went to the hospital rooftop while waiting for Grandma to finish. While sitting on a bench, he started thinking about Jae Ki-young, finally accepting that he had indeed caught feelings for his employer. He couldn't believe he would fall in love with someone as bad-tempered and scary as Jae Ki-young. It's so unlike him. Same. Baby Dan, same. Only, I realized my feelings since episode 1, so just imagine my suffering. Anyways, there's no denying the fact that he really is into Jae Ki-young. He tried denying it for so long, and now that he's finally admitting to it, it feels like he's a dam that's about to burst. Why have it taken him this long to realize it? Jae Ki-young had always been on his mind, even when he was not working for him. Isn't that what it's like to like someone? Speaking of Jae Ki-young, the sun being too harsh with its rays, it could only mean that it's already the middle of summer, and soon will be his birthday. Fast forward to one typical morning in the Jew residence. Dan watched Jae Ki-young eat his breakfast from the side. Now that he's being honest with his feelings, Dan doesn't hold back anymore from openly staring at his employer, nor does he stop himself from ogling at how handsome he is. Something that all of us already know, but Dan took for granted until recently. When Jae Ki-young caught him staring, he asked Dan if he had something to say. Although Dan initially said no, he eventually tried changing the topic by asking if there was an update about the nutrition shake incident. Jae Ki-young then explains how the investigation is still ongoing. The component analysis came back, though, and it turns out it's just a type of aphrodisiac and not a narcotic. And it's good that it didn't contain toxins or addictive substances. And with the culprit still at large, authorities consider the incident a malicious act. Well, that may indeed be the case, since if it really were Jae Ki-young who drank the shake, then the match would have been canceled immediately. Just thinking about it pisses Jae Ki-young so much that he swears he's going to make a jigsaw puzzle out of the culprit once he's caught. And Dan, for one, knows just how serious Jae Ki-young is with his threat. To lighten the mood, Dan said that it was a good thing that he was the unlucky victim instead. As soon as Dan said that, Jae Ki-young suddenly turned to look at him, which surprised Dan a bit, especially when Jae Ki-young asks him if he really doesn't remember anything from that night. Dan says no and explains how he blacked out as soon as he got into Jae Ki-young's room. He then asked Jae Ki-young if he had made a mistake that night. "Oh, you have no idea, dear. Then again, it's better that you don't remember anything." Anyways, with Jae Ki-young's sixth sense of humor, he tells Dan that he did make a huge mistake, and when Dan asked about it, Jae Ki-young cuts his meal short and leaves, making Dan wonder what exactly he did wrong, and if he actually made a complete fool of himself. "Oh, my, don't worry, dear, because that's exactly what you did." Fast forward to 3 weeks before Jae Ki-young's birthday, piles of boxes taller than Dan took up a huge space in the gym. They are all gifts for Jae Ki-young, and the incredible part is that more of them are coming. That's just how popular Jae Ki-young is, and according to Coach Teddy Bear, they're not just from his fans in Korea, as some of them also came from abroad, they kept coming, even though they kept telling them not to send them anymore. As the coach and Dan try to clear space by moving the gifts, the older man explains to Dan how the gym is so lively around this time of the year. Not only is there a lot of food being sent to them, but the other members also receive gifts as well. Dan wonders if Jae Ki-young is happy for all the attention, but Coach Teddy Bear tells him that Jae Ki-young hates having to pose for photos, so that isn't really the case. As for Jae Ki-young, he only considered the boxes a waste of space. At this point, Potato was saying that Jae Ki-young is practically an idol, although the other members think that no idol can hold a candle to their Hee-young. Jae Ki-young then asks Yosep how his birthday charity project is coming along. Yosep assures him that it's already in the process and that his fans even pitched in. Anyways, Jae Ki-young didn't really seem to care for details, and the conversation ended with that. Not far from where Jae Ki-young stood, Dan was again staring at his employer. Something about seeing those gifts made Dan want to get something for Jae Ki-young on his birthday as well. Meanwhile, Coach Teddy Bear approaches Jae Ki-young and tells him that the matchmaker is asking if Jae Ki-young is really good to go for his next match. And this time, it's for a defense title. The coach thinks that it's still too soon, considering that there's still that shoulder injury. But as expected, Jae Ki-young claims that he'll be ready anytime. Later that day, Jae Ki-young was having a sparring match with one of the other members when he suddenly flinched his shoulder. Dan is keen enough to notice it, so he stops the fight and makes Jae Ki-young come with him. Inside the treatment room, Dan tells Jae Ki-young to raise his left arm, which makes Jae Ki-young visibly flinch this time. Realizing that the jig is up, Jae Ki-young immediately snatches away his arm from Dan's hold. That said, Dan tells him his shoulder is in worse shape than before, but Jae Ki-young doesn't really care, as he claims that he can still throw a punch or two, even under such conditions. Dan tries to persuade Jae Ki-young to go to the hospital, but he refuses, pointing out how he already did the post-match medical checkup. Dan tries to insist since, if left untreated, it could even affect Jae Ki-young's next match. Even now, it already looks like he's going to need long-term treatment. But see, that's something Jae Ki-young doesn't want to hear. And so he instead gets angry at the person, who only thinks about his well-being, and asks Dan if he'll take responsibility if Jae Ki-young's next match gets canceled as a result of going through another checkup. Jae Ki-young then tells Dan not to push the matter, since he knows his body better than anyone else. That said, he orders Dan to forget about it and start to tape his shoulder instead. Although Dan did as he was told, he still can't help but worry about whether Jae Ki-young will really be fine this way. Dan is hard at work reviewing Jae Ki-young's old medical records and comparing them to the new ones, and he can tell just how big the differences are. Jae Ki-young's injury really had gotten worse. What's more, the injury is also causing issues in other areas of his body, and Jae Ki-young is definitely just enduring the pain all this time. What they could do is either go on a long-term recovery or a routine rehabilitation, although there's no way Jae Ki-young would agree to either. At this point, nothing would change Jae Ki-young's mind. Thus, the best that Dan can do is make sure the injury doesn't lead to an irreversible state. On a different note, as Dan was thinking about what else he could do for Jae Ki-young, he remembered how it would be his birthday soon. Perhaps a surprise present might improve Jae Ki-young's mood a bit, but since there isn't much time left, Dan wonders what he can get for him. Dan had always been the one receiving things from Jae Ki-young, so this time, he wanted to be the one to give. Later in the evening, Dan looks around the house for something that Jae Ki-young hasn't bought for himself yet, or something that he already has but needs to be replaced. But try as he might, Dan can't find anything, especially since everything in Jae Ki-young's house is new and shiny. Rich petard. Then again, that's to be expected of a world champion. Still, Dan believes that there should be something that Jae Ki-young uses daily and needs replacing. Soon after, Dan came upon Jae Ki-young's car keys and noticed that one of the keychains had a bit of worn-out leather. Dan looked optimistic then. A keychain seemed doable, even though there was no doubt that Jae Ki-young would want something nothing less than a high-end brand. Dan then turns to his phone for help to check just how much the tiny keychain would cost him. To his surprise, it was $700. What the fly? What's that keychain made of? A mammoth's hide. Anyways, safe to say there's no way Dan will be able to afford it. Not after he had already splurged buying that shawl for Grandma. Plus, he's still working on his advance payment, so it's not like he has any money coming in. He just didn't notice since his food and housing are already taken care of, and he's not like us, who hang out in online stores. Then again, who would have thought a day would come when he needs to spend that much money on something? As Dan was thinking about how he wished he had some part-time jobs to have some pocket money, a eureka dinged. That's right, a part-time job is exactly what he needs right now. Going back to his phone, he started looking for a quick gig that would suit him, and as if being guided by some unknown being, he soon found the right one. Fast forward to one cloudy night. Dan starts with his delivery boy gig. Since it's been a while since he did part-time jobs like this, he was amazed that now shops actually lend bikes to their part-timers for deliveries. Anyways, as was planned, he'd be making deliveries every night after his main job at the gym. In Dan's mind, J.K. Young is already stressed, having to deal with his injuries, so he hopes that giving him a birthday gift will give him a bit of strength. But Dan, my dear, that's only if he admits to his feelings about you as well. Or am I just being pessimistic about this? And so, Dan spends his evening riding his borrowed bicycle and running here and there to deliver food. Sometimes, he'd be rushed by his employer, called out by drunk old men in the street, and even asked by shameless housewives to take out trash. By the time his shift is over, the sun is rising, and he now has to rush back home since it's almost time for J.K. Young to wake up. The job was tough, but Dan didn't mind since the pay was good. If he keeps it up, then he'll be able to buy J.K. Young's gift before his birthday. Fast forward to breakfast time, Dan prepared J.K. Young's full breakfast course on time, with no problems. However, J.K. Young wondered why Dan was sleeping on the counter when he arrived from his morning run. Later that day, at the sports rehab center, while J.K. Young is doing some exercises for his shoulder, everyone can tell how he's struggling to move his injured shoulder. Dan is talking to the trainer, and, as expected, even he can tell that J.K. Young is in no condition to fight. Dan wonders if it's really impossible, even with sports therapy. And, of course, the answer is no. In fact, their best option is for him not to use his shoulder at all, or better yet, just quit training and fighting in matches for now. But of course, that isn't really an option J.K. Young would accept. The trainer added that if things go as they are, soon J.K. Young will need surgery, so he'll have to make it work with just one good arm for now. Dan promises to talk to J.K. Young about it, but we already know how that talk will end. On their way back from the rehab center, Dan asks J.K. Young if he's going back to training. And when the athlete says yes, Dan reminds him not to overdo it, as was advised by the trainer. As expected, J.K. Young got angry and, after slamming the car's steering wheel, sarcastically asked Dan if he'd be the one to fight in his place, because if that wasn't the case, and Dan should just shut up and do what he's supposed to do, which is exactly what he's already doing. Or are we talking about something else? Anyways, that was the end of the conversation. And once again, Dan is left feeling upset for getting J.K. Young angry. Later that night, the fatigue from his day and night jobs slowly catches up on Dan. He lightens up his situation by saying how this is the result of trying to live above his means, and thus, he tries to justify it by comparing what he does with what J.K. Young has been doing all this time. J.K. Young might be a world-class athlete who had enjoyed all the privileges that come with it, but at the same time, he also had to train like crazy, and he had been doing it for a long time, too. The pressure he must be feeling is no joke, although he doesn't let it show. With that as his motivation, Dan convinces himself not to give up on what he's doing. Then again, it seems like he's about to get another reality check. Dan was taken aback when he rang the doorbell for his next customer and realized who it was. Remember that poor guy 40 chapters ago that Dan replaced as J.K. Young's bread? Yeah, he's making a cameo, and as it turns out, he also recognized Dan from that time. The dude seems chill at first. That is until he tries asking about Dan and J.K. Young's relationship. But because of how Dan dresses and how he's working now as a delivery boy, he guessed that it's over between them too. When Dan denies it, the dude then concludes that J.K. Young is just being stingy with Dan. After all, he came out with extra compensation that night, even though he got beaten up, and yet Dan here is still looking broke. Well, he's not wrong. That said, this bitter tramp started running his mouth off, saying things like, Dan needs to do better with his bedroom techniques. After all, J.K. Young's only redeeming qualities are his big banana, and the money he has to spend. He forgot the face and body. That's only for me. Anyways, other than that, his personality is especially poop-worthy, and that he regrets that he couldn't keep milking J.K. Young. Both his banana and money, I presume. Dan is trembling in compressed anger, because he knows that all the dude said was right, but he still doesn't like hearing it. He then tells the dude that he shouldn't slander J.K. Young like that, and then tries to cut their transaction short by handing him his change. The dude noticed this, and as for a parting gift, he pointed out to Dan the thing that he dreaded to hear the most. He tells Dan how the two of them are no different, and that he shouldn't delude himself into thinking that he's special. After all of his previous breads met the same ending, because for Jae Ki-young, all of them are just as tools and nothing else. And once Jae Ki-young gets tired of him, that will be it. Which is, of course, not true. We have the two of them in the manhwa cover, right? And this is still tagged as romance. So, of course, Dan is special, since this is a romance series between them. And yes, I don't actually believe what I just said, but it's better than the implied reality. On his way back from delivery, Dan's thoughts were occupied by what the dude said, and before he knew it, his bicycle crashed after not seeing the bump on the pavement. Dan fell with injuries on his knees and palms. As he tries to get back on his feet, he reflects on what the tramp said. Dan wanted to deny everything that was said, even though he already knew the bitter reality deep down. And although he pretended that his words didn't bother him, that wasn't really it. The truth hurts, and Dan can't deny it, but at the same time, it's also hard to accept. The next day, Dan was doing a session with Jae Ki-young. He continues to do so even though his palms hurt every time he presses on them. But then Jae Ki-young noticed that parts of his arm and shoulder had traces of blood in them. Dan was horrified and immediately apologized, although Jae Ki-young didn't say anything. By dinner time, while the coach sent the other members for dinner, they just left Dan alone. Apparently, he had been skipping dinner to sleep, and although Jae Ki-young seems to have some thoughts about it, he still doesn't say anything. Fast forward to the day before Jae Ki-young's birthday. Dan received the gift he worked hard to buy. Although he thinks that it seems unnecessary to give, since Jae Ki-young's already receiving a lot from others, he still wants to give it to him. The parcel also includes a birthday card, so Dan decided that he could also write something to Jae Ki-young while he was on it. Although he was almost caught by Jae Ki-young when he suddenly barged into the room to tell Dan to prepare to go to work. When Dan and Jae Ki-young got to the gym later that day, confetti poppers were shot off and the gym members wished Jae Ki-young an early birthday. They explained that since Jae Ki-young would be busy tomorrow, they decided to throw the party today. After all, there's no way they'd miss wishing the great Jae Ki-young a happy birthday. Everyone started singing him a happy birthday and even put a party hat and glasses on him. But the festive atmosphere turned sour when Jae Ki-young made his dislike of the whole ordeal known. He looked really mad at the group and only calmed down when Yosep suddenly put an icing on his face and told him off for being such a party pooper. After all, they did their best to set everything up. Despite Jae Ki-young's bad personality, he still had a soft spot for those older than him. And so, he let it go. He then told everyone to hurry up and finish the cake so they could start their training. He even took a strawberry for himself as he did. And as punishment for his earlier behavior, Yosep announces that Jae Ki-young will treat them to grated beef at their dinner party later tonight, without Jae Ki-young's consent, of course. This whole time, Dan is just on the side, and glad that everyone is in high spirits. After all, they've been anxious around Jae Ki-young lately, because of his injury. He just hopes that after today, the atmosphere will improve. By dinner time, the whole gym had gone to the restaurant. Everyone is in a festive mood, eating and drinking. Daejeon then observed how Jae Ki-young was so busy that he couldn't even afford to drink even though it was his birthday, and Coach Teddy Bear just took the statement as a joke. As Jae Ki-young was busy catering to his fans, the coach voiced his concerns to Dan. He thinks that they had scheduled Jae Ki-young's next match too early. Not only did Jae Ki-young have to go through a lot when losing weight for his previous match, but he's doing another one right after that. Although it's what Jae Ki-young wanted, Coach Teddy Bear can't help but worry a lot and thinks he is partly to be blamed. Dan then asks if he's concerned about Jae Ki-young's injury. The coach said that it was part of it, but also because of the fact that Jae Ki-young was raking up victories and accomplishments at an unbelievable rate. Coach Teddy Bear worries that someday Jae Ki-young might end up with a serious injury. And although that's a bitter reality that every athlete has to face, the coach worries that Jae Ki-young might be unable to pick himself up from it. Well, Dan agrees to these concerns. After all, Jae Ki-young is pushing himself so hard because he hates losing. Suddenly, the coach bangs his glass on the table and exclaims that Jae Ki-young should be kinder to his body. But the dude doesn't listen, even though the coach greatly worries about him. On the bright side, though, he's glad Dan and Jae Ki-young are hitting it off. The coach points out how Jae Ki-young's performance has greatly improved since Dan arrived, and because of that, he's really grateful to him. Even Yosep thinks the same. In fact, they know that Jae Ki-young feels the same. It's just that he doesn't know how to show it. Dan humbly accepts the compliments. Finding an excuse to pour him a drink, the coach and Josip did not miss the chance. Dan wanted to pace himself, though, so he secretly put some of the soju into an empty cup. 20 minutes later, Jae Ki-young is back on the table. While he demanded a plate of beef for himself, he unknowingly took Dan's extra cup of soju and drank from it. He soon found out that it was not water, and angrily demanded who had put soju on his cup. Dan is horrified. As he explains that it is his cup, the already drunk coach Teddy Bear just laughs it off and tells Jae Ki-young that if he's going to drink, then drinking on his birthday is fitting. While Dan fussed with Jae Ki-young, everyone else found it hilarious that the man who refused to drink still ended up drinking. By the end of the party, some members were about to go for round 2 and invited Dan to join them. Dan tried politely refusing, although Jae Ki-young ended up sending them away himself. After all, Dan was supposedly coming home with him. He even puts his arm over Dan's shoulder and leans on him, making him flustered. The other members saw it as Jae Ki-young looking out for Dan and couldn't believe it, especially since Jae Ki-young didn't look like he would budge at all. But that was enough for the rest of the members to let them go, and so they bid their goodbyes. The blushing Dan looks at Jae Ki-young and thinks that he might be drunk. He got his answer as soon as everyone left, and Jae Ki-young wobbled beside him, straight out admitting that he was drunk, so Dan should lead the way. What the hell? What's with that face? He doesn't look drunk at all. And didn't he only take a sip? Well, I guess we just discovered a weakness. Anyways, as Jae Ki-young mumbled about how he really thought it was water, Dan couldn't believe that his guess earlier was right. By the time Dan and Jae Ki-young arrived home, Jae Ki-young's tipsiness is already obvious. At first, he doesn't recognize Dan, and then accuses him of being the one who got him drunk. Not that Dan denied it. In fact, he apologizes non-stop as he tries to help Jae Ki-young wobble into his room. When they were almost on the bed, Jae Ki-young reached his limit and fell on top of the bed with Dan under him. He's complaining of his head hurting while Dan flinches and blushes at their closeness. Dan's heart beats loudly in his chest as he starts feeling tipsy, too, but he has to keep it together for both of their sakes. Dan was just telling Jae Ki-young that he needed to change into his PAs when Jae Ki-young suddenly sat up and started taking off his shirt, as well as trying to take off Dan's. When Dan tries to resist, Jae Ki-young tells him that he thought Dan wanted to do it, and that's why Dan told him to take off his shirt. Dan then explains that he just wants to help him prepare for bed. Jae Ki-young then asks Dan if he doesn't want to do the rumpy-pumpy with him, because if that's the case, then he'll stop. The big man even backed off of Dan, surprising our Beatty. After all, this is the first time that Jae Ki-young has ever let him have a choice. Turns out, Jae Ki-young is like a different person when he's drunk. That said, Dan thinks that perhaps this is his chance to get to know Jae Ki-young more. And if Jae Ki-young is in the mood to be nice to him, he should take advantage of it. Dan then suddenly hugs Jae Ki-young and admits that he wants to do it as well. Soon after, the two of them are now in their birth suits. Dan boldly kissed Jae Ki-young on the lips and started peppering kisses on his face, but had to stop when he reached Jae Ki-young's ear. Not because Jae Ki-young got angry, but because it tickled him. Dan, on the other hand, noticed that Jae Ki-young didn't get mad, something that had never happened before as well. It made Dan wonder how someone as strong and scary as Jae Ki-young could fall just because of one drink. Not even one, but just a sip as well. Crazy, I know. Anyways, from Dan's perspective, Jae Ki-young is just like a cute sulky cat at the moment. Dan started laughing and giggling involuntarily, but instead of getting angry, Jae Ki-young just suddenly kissed him. Wanting to take full advantage of the circumstances, Dan shyly admits that he wants Jae Ki-young's lips on his body and not just his mouth. Dan tries to retract it soon after, although it seems too late. Jae Ki-young started by kissing Dan's neck and then moving down to his nip-nops. Dan trembles and twitches as Jae Ki-young's actions tickle him, although at the same time, it also feels good that it almost feels like they're actually making love. Suddenly, Jae Ki-young complains that his head is spinning, but then he also asks Dan why he keeps getting on his nerves lately. Dan is confused as to what Jae Ki-young is talking about. Instead of explaining himself, however, Jae Ki-young just glares at Dan, and then dismisses it. Whatever it is, Jae Ki-young then started drowning Dan with kisses, and the latter had no choice but to return the gesture. It's the shake for Dan. and soju for Jae Ki-young. Seems like these two can only express themselves freely when they're not themselves. The night grew deeper, and Dan, who is now covered in love bites, is once again at the mercy of the mighty Jae Ki-young. When Dan asks Jae Ki-young to slow down because he's being too rough, Jae Ki-young pauses and starts doing as he is told. This didn't make it any better for Dan, though, since Jae Ki-young is going too slow this time, he's hitting Dan in all the right places, making him feel so good. Dan slowly hugged Jae Ki-young's back, and it made him feel warm. In fact, this is Dan's first time to feel Jae Ki-young's warmth like this. Soon after, Dan felt like he was about to reach his limit. And so, Jae Ki-young unsheathed his sword from Dan's black hole, and then rubbed their swords together until they both reached the finish line together. Right after, Jae Ki-young felt dizzy and fell on top of Dan. But Jae Ki-young now unconscious, Dan had more freedom to organize his thoughts. He couldn't help but appreciate Jae Ki-young's smell and warmth. It's making Dan feel so good that he forgets how this is all just temporary. He knows that he shouldn't be feeling it, but Dan can't help but want more of this. As Dan's trembling hands turn to hug Jae Ki-young, he wishes that time would just stand still so they could be together longer like this. Morning came. It was Jae Ki-young who woke up first. Upon noticing Dan in the bed with him, he seems to remember the tids and bits of what happened last night. But since he's a betard who eats fried chicken for breakfast, he dismisses such thoughts and just blames everything on alcohol as he gets out of bed. Jae Ki-young's head is killing him from a hangover as he rummages in the cupboard, trying to look for something to fix him up. That was when his doorbell ding-donged. It seemed like it was an express delivery for him, and it was quite big, too. So Jae Ki-young was surprised. Meanwhile, Dan just woke up, and the first thing that he thought of was Jae Ki-young. Dude, just how smitten are you with that betard? Anyways, when Dan realized that Jae Ki-young must have been up already, he gathered the blanket that had been covering Jae Ki-young to try and feel his warmth and thought of how last night was the first time that he had ever felt that good. Dan finally got up from bed after the beeping of his phone, which was a reminder about Jae Ki-young's birthday. Seeing that, Dan hopes to be the first one to greet Jae Ki-young on his birthday and thus hurries to where he is. Soon after, Dan, who is now fully dressed, arrives in the living room with his gift for Jae Ki-young, only to be awestricken by the sheer number of gifts already magnificently sitting in one corner of the room. Dan is quick to notice Jae Ki-young seated on the sofa and asks him about his head and how he's feeling. Of course, Jae Ki-young is not okay. And so, Dan offers to warm up some soup for his hangover. He then tries to ask about the packages, and Jae Ki-young explains that they're birthday gifts, which also include the ones he had purposely left in the gym. It seems that Coach Teddy Bear sent them over without his consent. Unfortunately, the coach and his kids beat Dan to wish Jae Ki-young a happy birthday. That said, it's just another reason for Jae Ki-young to get annoyed since, according to him, he doesn't need all that expensive stuff. After hearing this line, Dan is having second thoughts about giving Jae Ki-young the gift he prepared for him. But his desire to give something to Jae Ki-young is holding him back. That aside, Jae Ki-young started complaining about feeling sick again, so Dan hurried to prepare the soup. While Dan started doing his thing in the kitchen, Jae Ki-young once again noticed the hickeys all over Dan's neck. He flinches at the sight and scolds himself for being crazy for giving those to Dan. Well, at least he's not an idiot for trying to deny the obvious. Fast forward to Jae Ki-young finally finishing his meal. He still complains that his head is killing him. So, Dan offers to get Jae Ki-young hangover remedies later, though Jae Ki-young doesn't seem to care. Anyways, with his heart beating loudly in his chest, Dan thought this was the perfect time to give Jae Ki-young his gift. Oh gosh, here goes nothing. And so, Dan timidly greets Jae Ki-young with a happy birthday, and then hands him the gift. Jae Ki-young didn't say anything at first, but took the paper bag from Dan's trembling hands. Upon checking it out, Jae Ki-young realizes that Dan has given him a designer item. Dan explains that it's just something small. Jae Ki-young then asks how Dan managed to buy it when he was broke. That's when Dan told him that he took some side jobs after work. More than the gift, it seems that this piece of information interests Jae Ki-young more. And so, he asks about Dan's side hustle, and the older man explains how he made deliveries at night and how he did it while Jae Ki-young was sleeping. Jae Ki-young then put two and two together and remembered all those times when he found Dan acting weird, including the nights when he would notice Dan was living in the house. Jae Ki-young then confronts Dan, asking him a rhetorical question of whether Dan's new side hustle is the reason why he's been getting on his nerves lately. Dan tries to point out that he noticed how Jae Ki-young's keyring was getting old, so he thought he'd get a new one for him. Dan then apologizes for bothering Jae Ki-young. And since this hot daddy of ours is a well-established beatard, of course, he didn't appreciate the effort at all. Jae Ki-young ominously asks Dan, who asked him to buy it. He also adds that Dan should have just done his job, instead of doing useless stuff. Safe to say the keyring lost its value at this point, as Jae Ki-young just dropped it on the table. The birthday boy then reminds Dan that his main concern should only be Jae Ki-young's physical condition, and that there's no way he's actually happy to receive something that he considers a piece of junk. Even though it obviously hurt, Dan had no choice but to apologize. Nonetheless, Dan still tries to justify what he did as something he feels obliged to do to repay for the things that Jae Ki-young did for him. But, as expected, Jae Ki-young didn't really care. Without saying anything else, Jae Ki-young started to walk away. But for some reason, Dan felt compelled not to end the conversation just like that. Dan began by saying that he wanted to be honest about his feelings toward Jae Ki-young. Now that got Jae Ki-young's attention, as he walked right before Dan and, at the same time, told the doctor that he already had an inkling of what he might mean by that. Well, Dan did look like he was about to confess, only he didn't, and he just told Jae Ki-young that he was grateful to him for everything he had done. This just makes Jae Ki-young angry, though, and once again, he reminds Dan that he hired him as his physical therapist and that he doesn't want to receive something like a gift from him. Deja vu? No wonder Jae Ki-young is angry. He even threw the key ring on the wall behind Dan. As Jae Ki-young walks out of the kitchen again, he reminds Dan that his next match is near, and if Dan finds himself slacking off and wasting time again, then he might just once again lose his job. A disheartened Dan walks towards the key ring that Jae Ki-young threw. Eventually, tears start dropping from his eyes. He didn't think that anything Jae Ki-young said would still hurt him, but they did, and he just couldn't stop crying. He let the warmth that he experienced last night disillusion himself into thinking that he would actually mean something to Jae Ki-young. His employer was just drunk and wasn't himself. It was just Dan who had misinterpreted everything. Picking up the key ring, Dan tried to wipe the tears from his eyes. He felt such an idiot for even bothering to make an effort to buy the gift. Dan was really just lonely, and he let this emotion get the better of him. Jae Ki-young was right. His ex-lover was right. Dan overestimated himself because he didn't want to face reality. Dan was being greedy for wanting more, and he deserved, so he shouldn't feel bad. Taking the key ring along with his box and paper bag, Dan threw all of them in the trash bin. All the while, he finally accepted the fact that from the start, there wasn't really anything special between him and Jae Ki-young. Nor was there any place for his feelings, since the two of them didn't even have a spark to begin with. Fast forward to one rainy afternoon. Jae Ki-young is sparring with someone named Seon-ho in the gym. From the looks of it, they were doing just fine. But when the round was finally over, and the coach went to Seon-ho to assist him and ask him if he could still keep going, the athlete was coughing as he tried to catch his breath. This action irritated Jae Ki-young, and suddenly, he told him to just leave if that was all he got, surprising both the young athlete and the coach. Jae Ki-young didn't just stop at that remark, though. He also pointed out how Seon-ho was bragging about his national achievements, and yet he couldn't even last 4 rounds. In the end, he's just wasting Jae Ki-young's time. But the worst that Jae Ki-young did, however, is to tell Seon-ho not to mention to anyone that he's Jae Ki-young's sparring partner, since it's embarrassing. That was, of course, a blow to the athlete's ego, and the other gym members didn't help by taking Jae Ki-young's side and ostracizing Seon-ho as well. That was the last straw for the younger athlete, and he cursed at Jae Ki-young and returned the insulting remarks. Not that anything he said was not true. Seon-ho said that he had not said anything before because Jae Ki-young was older than him, but he wouldn't put up with it anymore, so he'd just say it now. About how Jae Ki-young thinks he's better than everyone, and that he lets his title get into his head when he doesn't have basic manners. What's more, Seon-ho even bumps his shoulder into Jae Ki-young's, pissing the latter off. I mean, Jae Ki-young's arrogance is justified, as much as it hurts me to admit it, but only because he traded his manners with his skills in face and body and... Okay, I'm not stopping. Anyways, safe to say that the young athlete would never want to step foot inside the gym ever again after Jae Ki-young is done with him. Later that day, the coaches are talking with Jae Ki-young in the break room. Coach Teddy Bear pointed out how they already lost 3 athletes due to Jae Ki-young's temper. Yosef also added that Jae Ki-young should show respect to his fellow athletes. After all, even if they're not as good as him, they're still professionals. And that if this incident keeps happening, their gym might have problems in the future, especially if the other fighters start talking. When Jae Ki-young doesn't say anything, Coach Teddy Bear also tells him how they have to be extra careful these days since there are rumors that people are planting spies in gyms and bribing athletes to give out game strategies before matches. It wouldn't be good if their members' loyalties faltered and they betrayed Jae Ki-young. Even the directors are aware that Coach Teddy Bear is also feeling anxious. Jae Ki-young suddenly cut the coach and let him know that he didn't care about all that. After all, there's no way he'd just let himself lose just because a traitor gives away his data. And since that wasn't enough, Jae Ki-young started scolding his coaches as well, reminding them not to slack off since there are only 2 weeks until his match. And just like that, Jae Ki-young rudely leaves the room while Coach Teddy Bear angrily scolds him. Yosef manages to calm the coach down as he asks where the athletes' data are being supplied. The coach then explains that they were being fed to an underground sports gambling den to be used for betting. The worst part is they'll even rig the outcome if it means they can secure their win. That said, Coach Teddy Bear asks Yosef to find out if they have suspicious members trying to stir trouble and to see what the situation is in the other gyms. There's no doubt Jae Ki-young will be the biggest target since he's the most popular and will definitely rake in more bets. And it's frustrating that he's the one who cares the least. Anyways, it's been a while, but we're now meeting again the gorilla and his gang that Jae Ki-young beat up in Chapter 17. They were watching Jae Ki-young's interview from his most recent win. And on Gorilla's computer, we see a page for putting on bets. It seems that these betards are involved in the underground gambling den. Gorilla reprimands his minions for messing up their task. Turns out they were the ones responsible for the whole nutrition drink fiasco in America. He's angry for wasting his money for nothing. One of his minions apologized and explained that that was the best auction they had. Although this just angered Gorilla more, not only did it waste his money, but he also missed his chance to get his revenge on Jae Ki-young. The minion then pointed out that if he just wanted revenge, then they could beat Jae Ki-young up instead of just spiking his drink. Paffed. Yeah, right, cute. Anyways, Gorilla is a bit smarter than his minions, and knew that going after someone like Jae Ki-young is a moronic move. Is the biggest star athlete in Korea, for crying out loud. That said, Gorilla just ordered his minions to find another way to sabotage Jae Ki-young, so he could get revenge for being beaten up. Just then, Gorilla's phone started ringing for an incoming call from someone called Mr. Choi. It turned out to be Gorilla's boss, who also lost quite a bit because of the failed sabotage that they had planned in Jae Ki-young's last fight. Gorilla tried asking for a second chance, but Mr. Choi said that he was taking them off from this and would instead do it on his own. We then see his desk, where a bunch of Dan's photos and information are scattered. Ha, looks like baby Dan is once again put in danger because of Jae Ki-young. The members of the Team Black gym are surprised by the headline that Jae Ki-young's scheduled opponent got injured and is sidelined from their fight. Despite the news, it seems like the match with Jae Ki-young is still happening, although now it's with a different fighter. Jae Ki-young's new opponent is called Baek Joo-min and is part of the King of MMA, Jim and Butbyeon. At the mention of the name, one of the members exclaimed in concern and explained how he knew the dude through a friend. Hearing that, Dan came to the group and asked about the dude since he couldn't find anything about Joo-min when he tried researching. Another member then tells Dan how Baek Joo-min is a rising rookie. Although he's a newbie to MSC, he's of star quality. So their gym's CEO favors him, which explains why he got matched up with Jae Ki-young this early in his career. This matchup is better than canceling the whole event, especially since the tickets are sold out. However, there are still doubts about how it will turn out, especially since there are barely any videos of the dude's matches. Suddenly, Potato joins the conversation and points out how the sleazy dude should first collect a few more wins before he faces Jae Ki-young. Technically, he's just a no-name athlete. Plus, for some reason, Potato gets bad vibes from him. Well, if Potato says so, then there's no doubt that he's bad news. He does look like a villain, doesn't he? The rest of the members then started bad-mouthing the dude for being able to face Jae Ki-young easily when they had to work so hard just to get into MFC. However, it doesn't really matter, since Jae Ki-young will definitely breeze through the fight. The match is going to be a big deal, though, since both of the fighters are Koreans. In fact, articles about it are already being circulated. although from the headlines, it would seem like Baek Joo-min's side paid for them. Then, the member from earlier, who said that he knew Joo-min through a friend, tells them about the rumor of an underground fighting ring that only the rich participate in, and where Joo-min is a living legend. It seems like in this underground fighting ring, weapons are allowed, and some fighters don't even make it alive. If all of those rumors were true, then that just tells a lot about what kind of man this Joo-min is. Scary. One of the members points out how the said member seemed to know so well about the illegal fighting ring, but he insists that he just heard it from a Hyun of his. This kid might be one of the people Yoso should look into. Anyways, they started talking about how Joo-min is a real thug with no manners whatsoever. Although it's not like it's a big deal, since Jae Ki-young is the same. Whatever the case may be, everyone believes that Jae Ki-young will easily beat Joo-min, since the latter is short in experience. Potato asks Dan about his opinion, and Dan also agrees with them, although he does still look anxious. To change the topic, Dan reminded everyone about their evening training. Everyone then dispersed and started to do their warm-ups, leaving Dan to look and feel anxious by himself. Meanwhile, in the meeting room, it seems like Jae Ki-young's team is having a strategic discussion about Baek Joo-min. Although there isn't much information about the dude, they still could tell how he's an all-rounder who adapts his style depending on his opponent. Although the change in opponent is really sudden, they'll just have to roll with it and change their strategy accordingly. That said, since Jae Ki-young has an advantage in physique, he can just tire Joo-min and then end him with a strong finishing move. Then again, that's not foolproof, since the dude looks like he has solid offense as well. While everyone continued discussing, Jae Ki-young just stared at Joo-min on the TV screen and couldn't help but think how the dude looked familiar. Later that evening, Dan arrived home by himself. As he sat on the sofa, he was thinking about how Jae Ki-young would probably get home late again. It seems like they're barely interacting together these days. Ever since Jae Ki-young's birthday, he had been busy preparing for his new opponent, leaving early and then going home late. And even when they crossed paths, no words were exchanged. Dan can't bring himself to say anything to Jae Ki-young after the confrontation between them in Chapter 45. Not that it should matter, he should just focus on his work indifferently, since it's what he should do in the first place, and what the B-tard told him to do. On a different note, it seems like tomorrow is an important day, since Grandma's biopsy result will be out. Dan earnestly hoped that it would be good news. Dan goes to his room and looks at the photo of him and Grandma. He reflects on the fact that she's been in the hospital for so long, and he's always been busy to visit her. However, it doesn't really matter as long as, at the end of the day, Grandma gets better. In fact, he promised himself that once Grandma was all better, he would go on a trip with her. After all, she had been so busy raising him, and never had a day off for herself. The next day, after Dan visited Grandma's doctor, everything became a blur. All Dan could remember was how the doctor was telling him that the cancer was not shrinking at all, and she was not showing improvement with the new treatment, so surgery wasn't an option either. Given her age, no new medicine can also be given, as an alternative. That's why Dan should prepare himself for the worst. When Dan finally manages to go to Grandma's room, his face is still stricken with tear stains. He slowly walks towards Grandma's bed and sits on the chair next to it. He just sat there and watched Grandma sleeping peacefully. He then remembers all those memories he had with Grandma, from when he was still a snot-nosed kid, to elementary school, to high school, and finally, after fishing college. Grandma was with him in all of the milestones in his life. Suddenly, Grandma wakes up and notices Dan. She asks him why he's crying, although Dan tries to deny it. Grandma then assures him that there's nothing to feel sad about since she's fine. She then tells Dan to take the red bean, bun, and yogurt she saved for him in the fridge, since he's looking thin. Hearing her words of worry, Dan couldn't help but feel guilty for all those times when he used being busy as an excuse not to visit her more often. Then again, it's not like he can turn back time and do something about it. And so, Dan just started crying. Grandma then pulls him closer and whispers to him about a favor she has. Meanwhile, Dan receives a message on his phone from an unknown number. They introduce themselves as King of MMA, Gym's executive director, of which Baek Joo-min is a part. This is so sus, although, for the record, I'm not worried about Dan's loyalty. It was late afternoon when Dan was on his way back from the hospital. He was checking his phone, which was ringing for a call from an unknown number, which he had been getting a lot lately. Not that he bothered answering. Once again lost in thought, Dan remembers the doctor's words about preparing for the worst regarding Grandma. Not that he had any idea how to do that when, All this time, he had been living only thinking about Grandma getting better someday. Dan was just about to enter the Team Black building when some old man called out to him. Dan tries to politely ask him what he needs, to which the man explains how he's been trying to get a hold of Dan for a while now and even tried calling him earlier. He then introduced himself as Troy Gilsiak. Sounds familiar? Anyways, after identifying himself as the director of King of MMA Gym, he handed Dan his calling card. Without letting Dan respond, he tells him how Dan is very hard to reach and that he's been dying to meet him, which is why he went all the way to the Team Black gym. He then tries to invite Dan to eat, although Dan just politely declines the offer and is just about to leave. The old fart is persistent and tries to convince Dan to change his mind. But when the younger man doesn't look like he's going to budge, the old man then started talking about how he knew about the bad news about Dan's grandma. That caught Dan's attention. Grabbing this chance, the old fart then started talking about how he sympathized with Dan. He also shamelessly added how he has important information that Dan might find useful. Therefore, they should talk. Ha, can you believe the shamelessness of this old fart? Seriously? Right in front of your opponent's doorstep? Not long after, they find Dan and the old fart at a cafe having coffee. The old man tries to act friendly at first, beating around the bush and all, but Dan does not fall for it. He went straight to the point and asked the old fart about how he found out about Grandma's condition, and if he had been digging things about Dan. The old man denies the accusations and explains how he's just been asking around about Dan, because he's someone that the old fart is interested in. Same thing, old fart. He points out that because the MMA fighting world is small, talks about Dan's skills have been going around in several gyms. He added that, as Dan might already know, one of their fighters is matched against Jae Ki-young. They're really honored and grateful for the opportunity, and that's why he wanted to talk to Dan and ask for some pointers on taking care of an athlete. Well, Dan realized that the old fart wasn't really being honest and asked him if that really was his intention for reaching out to him. Because if it's not, he should just be honest about it. That's when the old fart started being serious and really got down to business and straight up told Dan that he wanted to recruit him for their gym. Once again, not letting Dan get a chance to have a say, the old fart explained how he wanted Dan to oversee Jumin's care. As for compensation, they'll double Dan's current salary and even give him a house in Gangnumbers. They'll even go as far as providing him with a car for his commute. It's an offer that's exclusively tailored for him. Dan didn't look convinced, though. He explained that he doesn't need all that luxurious stuff, nor does he deserve it, as there are plenty of people who have better skills than him in this industry. And so, Dan politely declines it. That's when the old fart once again brought up Grandma by enticing Dan to a new medication she can take. Taking the opportunity while Dan is taken aback, the old fart started explaining that the reason the doctors told Dan that there's nothing more they can do about Grandma is because the medicine imported in Korea is subpar. However, there's news about a new drug that's in development in the States and is supposed to be miraculous. Although it's already circulated in the States, it'll take a long time before it becomes available in Korea, and that's why Korean patients don't have much of an option. On that note, the parent company of the King of MMA, Gym, just happens to be the pharmaceutical company that makes the medicine. Therefore, the old fart will be able to have Grandma get treated in the States, plus all expenses paid, but only if Dan accepts the job offer. However, if taking the job is too much, Dan can also just share some information about Jae Ki-young, like his game plan for the match and the status of his injury. Dan flinched and looked like he just heard the most absurd thing in the world. Well, he looked really conflicted. Nonetheless, after all, he's choosing between his grandma and the man he loves, not to mention his integrity. And honestly, I wouldn't blame him if he chose either, although I'm confident that he'll choose the right thing. Later that night, it was already very late when Jae Ki-young arrived home. Dan is also still up and is tinkering on his laptop. Noticing Jae Ki-young's arrival, Dan stood up and thought of giving Jae Ki-young a massage and letting Jae Ki-young know what had happened earlier. It was already past midnight when Dan went to the living room and saw Jae Ki-young watching a video of Jumin's fight. Jae Ki-young was so engrossed in the fight that he didn't notice Dan until the latter called out to him. Dan then asked Jae Ki-young if he wanted to get a massage before going to bed, which should help him sleep better. He also added that there's something he wants to tell Jae Ki-young about. Before Dan could expound on the matter, however, Jae Ki-young flat out declined his offer. Well, Dan didn't insist and thought that was probably for the better. After all, knowing about what the old fart did might throw Jae Ki-young off his game. Dan remembers what happened in the afternoon. The old fart was asking him to give the offer a thought, but of course, Dan didn't fall for it. Dan suddenly stood up and pointed out that sharing Jae Ki-young's information was exactly the reason why he should turn down the job offer. After all, he can't betray Jae Ki-young. Safe to say, the old fart is surprised that Dan turned it down, as he was so sure Dan would easily give in. Dan then turned to leave and told the old man not to call him again. And since the old fart is a sore loser, his Mr. Nice Guy mask is thrown out the window as he angrily exclaims that Dan would regret turning him down. But Dan didn't look back at it at all, nor did he regret what he did. In fact, he thinks that the old fart is crazy for bringing up Grandma and asking him to betray Jae Ki-young just like that. Back to the present, Dan really wants to let Jae Ki-young know about what happened, but he's worried that it would only add to Jae Ki-young's stress. Not that it would really matter because, as far as Dan is concerned, Jae Ki-young doesn't really care even if he decides to accept the offer. Even now, all Jae Ki-young thinks about is looking ahead and only cares about his career. And so, Dan bids Jae Ki-young goodnight and makes a mental note to tell Jae Ki-young about it next time. Not long after, Jae Ki-young receives a message from his phone. It was from an unknown number, and it contained a bunch of pictures where Dan was meeting and talking with the old fart from earlier that day. Jae Ki-young is so surprised when he realizes who the old fart is. So, is this another case of misunderstanding and whatnot? I do not like where this is heading at all. Fast forward to the face-off. For the MFC 298 main event, we see the Emperor Jae Ki-young and the rising star Ju-min in their pre-fight encounter, one day before the match. And despite the biased hype in favor of his opponent, Jae Ki-young is still as cool as ever. Not long after the press conference, Jae Ki-young's team is in the hallway on their way home. Coach Teddy Bear asks Jae Ki-young how he's feeling, and Jae Ki-young assures him he's fine. Suddenly, the old fart calls out to Jae Ki-young, surprising his coach, who looks uncomfortable seeing the old man. Right behind the old man is Ju-min and his team, approaching the previous team in a false friendly manner. Anyways, the old fart went straight to greet Coach Teddy Bear and made small talk. Meanwhile, Jae Ki-young stares at the old man and then looks at Dan, who seems uncomfortable after he remembers what transpired between them previously. Jae Ki-young frowns at Dan's expression, but doesn't say or do anything. Whatever it is that he's thinking, however, is interrupted when Ju-min calls out to Jae Ki-young. He offers his hand for a friendly handshake as he tells Jae Ki-young how honored he is to get a match with him. At first, Jae Ki-young just stared at the hand, but still took it in a firm grasp. That was when Ju-min suddenly asked Jae Ki-young if he didn't remember him. Ju-min then leans closer to Jae Ki-young and whispers something in his ear, after which Jae Ki-young glares at him. Ju-min was grinning at Jae Ki-young in a friendly manner, as the old fart called his athlete over and bid goodbye to everyone. Safe to say, if that encounter was meant to taunt Jae Ki-young, then they obviously succeeded. Fast forward to the car ride back, Coach Teddy Bear reminds Jae Ki-young to get plenty of rest since the match is tomorrow morning. For some reason, though, Jae Ki-young had been silent and had been giving his Hee-young the cold shoulder. The coach thought that it was because Jae Ki-young was anxious about the match, so he assured him that Jae Ki-young had nothing to worry about since his skill level was much better than Ju-min's. Not that it did anything. Later in the evening, Jae Ki-young was taking a shower and thinking about his encounter with Ju-min earlier. Turns out, when Ju-min leans to whisper something to him, he calls Jae Ki-young names and throws in a bunch of insults. It seems that the two of them knew each other from when they were kids, and Baldy is Jae Ki-young's bully. As much as I want to see Daddy as a kid, I don't think I'd like to see him being bullied. He's still a petard, though. Anyways, the taunting continued as the nasty Baldy told Jae Ki-young how he would be taking the belt from him. Jae Ki-young is, of course, very upset and regrets not ending the dude right then and there. The Baldy obviously knows Jae Ki-young well enough that he knows exactly where to hit him. Not that Jae Ki-young will just let it be, as he swore to beat the dude in his game, despite whatever it is that he's scheming. After all, Jae Ki-young is the emperor who never loses. The next day, everyone was in the prep room waiting for the match to start, while everyone else is fussing over Jae Ki-young. Dan is getting busy double-checking the drinks and other stuff that they might need, such as the sports tape, hand wraps, and massage gels. Potato notices Dan using the relief spray himself and walks to him to ask what he is doing. Dan explains that he just wants to be extra careful ever since the whole nutritional shake fiasco just to be safe. Totally getting the idea, Potato offered to help, and the two of them tried all the stuff on themselves. Suddenly, the old fart comes into the room, with two other men behind him. Coach Teddy Bear was quick to ask the old man what he was doing there, to which the old fart just explains that he just wants to wish the team good luck, since today's event is a huge deal. He then asks about Jae Ki-young's condition, while bragging about how Ju-min didn't sleep last night because of nerves, as if, well, Jae Ki-young also lost some sleep, but for a different reason. Coach Teddy Bear tries to politely ask the old fart to leave, although it seems like the old man doesn't look like he's going to budge. That is until the pissed-off Jae Ki-young himself made a move to shoo the old fart out. That's when the old fart started making a fuss, insulted that Jae Ki-young addressed him informally and called him an old man. Although whether it was just an act or he really was offended, we might never know. Also, he deserved it. The silly old fart tried to attack Jae Ki-young, and the younger man was more than willing to retaliate. The commotion got everyone's attention, including Dan and Potato, who left their little corner to try to help break the quarrel. And right at that moment, one of the men that came in with the old fart swapped the relief spray Dan and Potato was checking earlier with another can that he had with him. Holy macaroons. So, it was all an act. I have a very, very bad feeling about this. Meanwhile, MFC staff are already hauling the old fart out of the room and telling him that he'll be escorted out of the stadium if he keeps causing problems. The old man tries to justify his actions, although it's quite obvious he's really at fault. After the old fart was sent away, Potato angrily curses after the old man. Coach Teddy Bear calms him down, explaining that the old fart was actually the representative of the Korean Martial Arts Players Federation, and that's why he thinks so highly of himself. Anyways, the match starts in an hour, so the coach advises everyone to just focus on preparing, and especially reminds Jae Ki-young not to mind the old fart so much. Not that Jae Ki-young needs the reminder. And so, Jae Ki-young started warming up by throwing a couple of punches with Yosep's help. Suddenly, Jae Ki-young felt a throb on one of his ankles, making him pause. As Dan and Yosep started fussing over Jae Ki-young, the latter just asked Dan to apply for pain relief on the area and asked for the spray. Dan dutifully did as instructed, but immediately regretted what he did. Jae Ki-young's ankle had immediately turned red, and Jae Ki-young was trembling in pain. In a panic, Dan was asked what he just sprayed. Now it's Dan's turn to tremble. Ah, I knew it. I don't think my heart can take what's going to happen next. Going back to the time before the old fart and his men went inside Team Black's prep room, the old man asks one of his men if everything is already set. The man in question, who also happens to be the one who made the swap from the previous chapter, explains that just one spray from the can will make Jae Ki-young get an instant burn. He then asks the old fart if they really had to go that far, especially since they really will get into trouble if they get caught. The old fart got angry and told the man to just man up and do as he was told. After all, even if they do get caught, they can just bribe the authorities to let them go. They had to resort to this. Since he already tried to sabotage Jae Ki-young and Dan's relationship with a photo, he had sent Jae Ki-young previously. But it never seemed to have done anything. Therefore, if they want to win the match, they can't be picky with their tactics. And so, despite his better judgment, the man had no choice but to do as he was told. Soon after, they began their plan by inviting themselves to Jae Ki-young's designated prep room. Back to the present, Dan dropped the can he was holding, trembling as he tried to explain that he had no idea what had just happened. Jae Ki-young glared at Dan, though not just him, but also the coach. The worst part is, they have to go on stage in 15 minutes. The coach worriedly asks Jae Ki-young if he can still move and if he's still okay with fighting. As expected, Jae Ki-young says that he is and just tells them to cover the wound and put on an ankle guard. As Dae-gi-yoon and Yosep worriedly fussed over Jae Ki-young, they still tried to be optimistic about the situation. Dan then offers to do the dressing of the wound, but Jae Ki-young angrily smacks Dan's hand away. Eftar Jae Ki-young glared at Dan as he told him not to touch him. Without saying anything else, he declares that he's going to the MFC Medical Center. The other members tried to stop him, although it was not like they had any choice. And so everyone else followed Jae Ki-young out of the room, with only Potato addressing Dan and telling him to take his time before following them. Obviously, Dan is still very much shaken by what happened. As Potato followed everyone out, he couldn't help but wonder what could have happened. After all, everything was fine when he and Dan checked the canister earlier. After everyone had left the room, Dan fell to his knees and started crying. He just couldn't believe how things unfolded, despite all the precautions he had taken. Instead of helping, he just made things worse for Jae Ki-young. This is so heartbreaking. I feel like crying as well. Not long after, the MFC 298 main event starts. As Jae Ki-young entered the ring, the commentator didn't miss noticing the ankle guard he was wearing and wondered if Jae Ki-young had sustained a last-minute injury that might as well affect his performance in the match. Jae Ki-young did not make it obvious that he was hurting, though. The Baldy, however, seemed to be fully aware of it. Anyways, it was Jae Ki-young who made the first move by giving the Baldy a straight, although the latter easily avoided, after which he went straight to Jae Ki-young with a clinch and effectively pinning him against the cage. There was a struggle at first as the two of them grappled, that is, until the cheating Baldy stepped on Jae Ki-young's injured foot. Seeing the opportunity, the Baldy indiscriminately stomped on it, as if his life depended on it. Despite the injury being visible, the move still doesn't count as a foul by official rules, and so, Jae Ki-young had no choice but to just hold on and try to break free. Jae Ki-young eventually managed to escape Baldy's grip and give him a solid hook. Unfortunately, the damage has already been done, and Jae Ki-young's foot is now bleeding heavily. Despite the bruised face, the Baldy is still grinning shamelessly at Jae Ki-young, further taunting the Emperor, and so, Jae Ki-young started his counter with a vengeance as he showered his opponent with heavy blows right in the face, hopefully making the Baldy uglier than he already is. Jae Ki-young picked up his pace in throwing his punches, and everyone thought the match would end in the first round. Unfortunately, the Baldy held on until the end of the round. Once Jae Ki-young is back in his corner, the coach tells him to calm down and to try not to get too close, since Baldy is better at grappling than they thought. Meanwhile, in the opposite corner, the disgusting Baldy is still grinning, while one of the people assisting him whispers about the plan that they concocted. Before they knew it, the next round had begun. Once again, the Baldy wasted no time and went for a waistlock. Jae Ki-young tries to get away from the clinch by punching Baldy, but the latter isn't budging at all. In fact, he even managed to break Jae Ki-young's balance and slam him on the floor. The worst part is that Jae Ki-young landed on his injured shoulder. Of course, it hurt a lot, but Jae Ki-young had no time to waste as the effing iftard son of a bell zeroed in on Daddy's injured shoulder. Baldy held on to Jae Ki-young's neck while holding his left arm between his legs. As Jae Ki-young struggled to get away, the effing Baldy found an opportunity to taunt him once again, which is a big mistake, as he didn't notice Jae Ki-young's other arm coming to elbow his head and effectively escaping the grip. Despite the throbbing shoulder and the bleeding foot, Jae Ki-young was still full of energy as he glared at Baldy. This time, it was Jae Ki-young who was doing the taunting, as he declared how the match would have been long over if he wasn't injured. And, of course, we know that those were not just empty words. Anyways, as the two athletes got back on their feet, we saw Dan finally arriving to watch the match. His face was stricken with tear stains.